The Canuckonomicon is a book of forbidden lore buried deep within the muck at the bottom of Lake Erie. It is said that once every 100,000 years it emerges from the grime and is held aloft by the furry mitts of a fearsome Sasquatch. Luckily, transcriptions are readily available online, such as here. So, hey everyone, our show is made possible only because of the support of our listeners. We don't have corporate sponsors and rely on your support to pay for things like research materials, recording equipment, and delicious, delicious coffee. If you like this show, then head over to patreon.com/Canuckonomicon to sign up and give us some monthly support. Or if maybe you can only help us with a one-time gift, then head over to ko-fi.com/Canuckonomicon. That's coffee.com/Canuckonomicon. And buy us a coffee. Or some whiskey. Or some coffee with whiskey in it. Finally, if both of those are just not in the books because you've already spent your Patreon budget getting swag from Joe Rogan's horrible little show, then head over to iTunes or Podchaser and give us a review. Let us know how much you love the show. Spread the words. Tell your friends. Tell your hairdresser. Tell that sex worker who works on the corner by your office and you've always debated hiring but just can't bring yourself to do it. Also, buy them a coffee. They're a person too. And tell them about our podcast. Anyways, on with the show. I'm your host, Benjamin Jr. Wandio. This is my podfather, Todd Dirty Clyde Wandio.
Salutations.
Say hi, Dad.
I did.
There he is.
I did, but you keep breaking up on me.
Yes, you're breaking up a little on me too.
I'm sorry. Because I'm talking over you. Oh, okay. Well, awesome. My internet must just suck. We have our special guest here too today, Canadian girl from the Nothing Ever Happens in Canada podcast. So yeah, why don't you tell us a bit about your show?
My show is a Canadian podcast, like you said. We talk about myths, legends, and just good stories Canada has to tell. And I kind of take you on a little tour around the place and tell you what I know about it and let you decide for yourself usually how it plays out.
That's much different from mine, where I mostly yell about fascism. Not
and
today,
make stuff
though.
Up.
and make stuff up. Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. It's the first time I've done research for a topic on a real person where fascists or Nazis don't show up at some point. So, really refreshing. So, why don't we get on with it? I'm going to tell you what I found. You're going to interrupt me, because that's how the show works.
Deal.
All right. So, when we talk about Canadian rock music, there are a few names that readily come to mind. Bands and musicians like Rush, Leonard Cohen, and the Guess Who have undoubtedly had an unshakable influence on the landscape of music. But those three in particular have kind of one thing in common. You wouldn't know they were Canadian if you didn't ask. Which, yeah, for the most part, Canadian rock music has sounded pretty much identical to American rock music. There was never anything particularly interesting or uniquely Canadian about it. Most of those artists were looking to be marketable to Americans because America was where you went if you wanted to be successful. You couldn't just make it in Canada. For one, there wasn't really a market up here for Canadian music. Before 1971, Canadian radio wanted nothing to do with Canadian artists. And even after the Canadian content laws were passed in 1971, most radio stations stuck all their Canadian programming into so-called beaver hours, which were usually around midnight and other non-peak hours. In the 70s and 80s, due to those laws, Canadian music did start getting airtime, but this had another effect. Canadians started to perceive Canadian music as inferior to American or British acts, and believed that the music was only getting played because of the CanCon quotas. If these musicians couldn't make it down south or across the Atlantic, then they obviously weren't any good, right? The worst part about this sentiment? Well, they weren't entirely wrong. A lot of this music really was only getting played because of CanCon quotas. The Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, also called the CRTC, had to crack down on this by changing the regulations and requiring CanCon to be played between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. so that Canadian music couldn't just be crammed into the few hours around midnight. Now, this is like when you were coming of age, right, Dad?
Yes. I was 71. I was 8. But yes, I do remember a sort
8?
of influx of Canadian music at that time.
Yeah.
But we
Well, and in the 80s too, like that's when like CanQuan actually increased its requirements. So in the 71 when the CanCon laws were first passed, it was 25% of music on the radio had to be Canadian content. But by the 80s, radio licenses were requiring now a full 30% of the music played to be Canadian
yeah, well, in
content.
the 80s,
And
in
nowadays,
the 80s, all the good new wave music was local. So we were hearing a lot of local acts, and we were hearing a lot of stuff, just from Canada. I mean, new wave hadn't even hit the States yet.
no, you have an example, Rush, a prog rock band, huge influence on progressive rock in the States and even up till now. Nowadays, our CanCon quotas are actually at 40%. Now, almost half of everything played on the radio has to be Canadian.
Oh, I didn't know it was actually that high.
Yeah, it's quite high. You don't notice because a lot of Canadian music, even back then and even nowadays, like they really try to cater to American audiences by just including a lot of American references and American kind of
Yeah, for sure.
feel
Yeah.
and sound. Yeah, like Dallas Green, City and Color. His name is literally Dallas.
I never even thought about it like that, but yes, you're right.
So yeah, we're looking at about 30% by the 80s. Which is a lot higher than I thought too when I was looking
Yeah,
at it.
I was
thinking
surprised
it was
by
gonna be
that.
like 10 or 15%.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would have thought that too. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, even now it's actually higher, which also surprised me. I thought they had been kind of laxing on it a bit because we now have more of a Canadian music industry, which was it was a big problem when they first introduced them, is that part of why there weren't many good Canadian acts is there wasn't really a Canadian music industry to support these acts, especially in pop music. Like Clyde or Todd, Clyde, whatever. I don't know what we're going to call you now, Dad. um, like you said, there was a lot of new wave stuff, but new wave was very independent. It wasn't supported by a huge mass market push like pop music or rock and roll was.
There were a lot of emerging recording studios in the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the 70s, if you wanted to record, you pretty much had to go to a major city, either
Right.
Vancouver or Toronto.
Yeah.
And then that, I mean, of course, there were always small market ones, but if you wanted to get the ears of a big label,
Yeah.
which was always
Right,
the aim.
right.
Yeah.
So,
And if you wanted that, you had to sound like an American band.
I like City and Color. I never even thought about that until you said that. I'm gonna think that every time now.
Yeah, so a lot of the acts that were getting played were underproduced, generic, or often just kind of bad. And Canadian music that was good was basically indistinguishable from American or British acts. No one was singing about life in Toronto or Vancouver. Songs were about San Francisco and New Orleans. There was literally a band in the 1970s from Canada that was just called Alabama. They released one album in 1973 with 2 songs called Song of Love and Highway Driving. On the other hand, bands like Canadian Zephyr, who performed from 1969 to 1983, didn't really see success outside of Canada, and as a result went largely ignored.
I can see
I don't know, have you heard Canadian Zephyr?
Never.
No, I've never even heard the name. The Stampeders were huge in the 70s.
Oh yeah,
And guess where they were from?
Calgary, right?
They named themselves after the local football team.
Isn't there also a Stampeders team in Saskatchewan? No, that's Rough Riders.
No, that's Roughies.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, the Stampeders did the song "Sweet City Woman."
Yeah.
Which is if you play it in the States, people love it, but it was a huge Canadian hit.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we're 1984. We have a little bar band. They played at a couple college gigs from Kingston, Ontario, who would completely change this perception of Canadian music. This band at the time consisted of saxophonist Davis Manning, Johnny Fay on the drums, Gord Sinclair on the bass, Bobby Baker on guitar, and at the front of the band, a figure who would go on to become a Canadian legend, Gord Downie.
Woohoo!
This band... Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can tell we're all Canadian here.
Kitty. Yeah.
Even
She's here for
happy.
Gord.
Yes. Yeah. So this band was the Tragically Hip, which for my American listeners, go listen to them. You'll love them.
Yes.
Maybe. I think you will. I think everybody who listens to them, other than my wife, loves them.
Oh dear.
My wife doesn't like Gord singing.
Oh no.
Gord is intentionally always a little bit under the note.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yep.
Intentionally. Like I used to think this guy can't sing, but when we saw him live,
Yeah.
he was exactly under the note. I mean, that was intentional.
For sure.
That stuff.
Well, you hear him on City and Color's song Sleeping Sickness, and he's spot on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He's not under the note in that song.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I love that song, Sleeping Sickness, which, for my 15 American listeners, if you haven't heard it, go listen to it.
I have been teaching sleeping sickness all month. The whole month of September was sleeping sickness month for all my my teenage guitar students because their parents insisted they learn it. So
Well, this is the anniversary month of Gord Downie's passing.
it
Yep.
is.
In fact, when this episode releases, it will be 2 years to the day that Gord Downie passed away, October 17th, 2017.
Yeah, 2 days before my birthday. What a crappy
Aw.
birthday present.
Yeah.
I can't believe it's been
Ouch.
2 years already. It doesn't feel so long.
Yeah, it's already been 2
years.
years. I remember actually going over to my mom and dad's place to watch his last concert.
Yeah.
Would have been a year before.
The hip, yeah.
Yeah.
I
It
think
was-
everybody in
it was
Canada
almost
watched that
exactly a year
concert.
before.
And I
Yeah.
think we all wept, at least in our hearts.
We
if
all
not in
did,
reality.
yes.
So this band was the Tragically Hip. As the Hip started leaning more into seriously seeking success, Davis Manning would actually end up leaving the band in order to pursue his life of quiet session musicianing and having a family. He made his intentions known, according to legend, by spray painting the words "The Hip Live Between Us" on the wall of a bar in Kingston, where it remained until 2005, 21 years after he made the painting, when they were finally painted over by local business owners who hate fun and spit on our cultural heritage. This artwork was actually used as the 1997 cover art for the Hip album, Live Between Us. Davis Manning would see the modest success as a local session musician and a stable family life, for which he left the band. He was replaced by guitarist Paul Langlois, who would go on to be a fixture for the band for the rest of its existence. This was in 1986.
Paul actually learned how to play guitar just to join the band.
Cool.
Really?
I didn't know that.
He was Gord's best friend. Lived across the street.
Yeah. That's
Opportunity.
wild. Yeah, well, he went on to become a member of one of the most famous bands in Canada, so good for him.
Kidding.
So, how did the hip shatter the cultural landscape of Canadian music? Well, we'll discuss that after this quick break. Crows go by many names in Canada, including the Dark Rats of the Sky, the Murderous Dozen, Feathered Nightmares, and Good God, This Thing is Eating My Dead Father's Eyes. Crows and ravens are often mistaken for one another. However, crows can be told apart by ravens by a few features. For one, the American crow, the most common species of crow in Canada, is considerably smaller than the common raven. The common raven has a wingspan of 1 to 1.5 meters in adulthood, whereas the American crow has a wingspan of between 80 centimeters and a meter. Another important difference is that crows often wear monocles, smoke pipes, and have small deerstalker caps. The most famous crow in Canada is Canuck, who also happens to be Canada's greatest private investigator. Wrongfully accused of stealing a knife from a crime scene, the reality is that Canuck was actually investigating the crime himself. Once he had properly examined the evidence, he returned the knife to the police. His attempts to share his findings were stymied by the language barrier between crows and humans, and thus he was forced to confront the criminal on his own, a raccoon named Frederico von Stripeyface. The battle was long and lasted from dawn till dusk, but ultimately Canuck rose victorious after knocking his opponent into a waterfall. Canuck is now married and has children, however he can never truly rest soundly, as he fears the raccoon Frederico may still be alive somewhere in Vancouver. This has been Hunterlund's Who's Who. It's so dumb.
Gotta do something.
That's the dumbest one. Did your lady love have something to do with the names? No,
Well,
yeah, and the
That was good.
that one I made up
Frederico von
myself.
Stripey Face and all that.
I'm just a dork. Canuck the Crow is a real crow from Vancouver. He is owned, well, not owned, but he's like friends with a human, and he actually recently went missing. It's a huge scandal.
Oh dear.
Well, you know that ravens wouldn't be caught dead in one of our episodes. They're just too cool.
Wouldn't be caught dead in one of our episodes. Ever.
No.
At all. Is that you telling me no? Don't write it?
No, dude. You live your life, man. It's your show.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. These are so dumb. I don't know why we keep doing them. They're awesome.
Yeah.
I love it. Anyways, so the Tragically Hip started out as many bands did back in the 1980s, and do even now. They were a bunch of locals from a city, in this case Kingston, Ontario, and they got together and decided to start a band. The band was actually initially started by Rob Baker and Gord Sinclair, the guitarist, a duo that called itself The Rodents. That band name is actually referenced in the music video for their 1998 song Poets, which is my personal favorite song off their album Phantom Power. Do you know the song Poets?
Yes.
Oh, I do. I know every
That's
hip
the best song.
I was gonna say I know most of them. I think.
I know all of them except all the crappy ones on that blue EP.
Wait. That's... Oh, what's that EP called now? Oh, now I can't
Well, it had
remember.
the song
No, I was gonna say,
"Small
I don't know
Town
anything
Bring
about that. I don't know
Down."
album
And,
names.
Oh, the Tragically Hip EP, the first
it was
one.
horrid.
Yeah, well, it was just their demo tape,
I don't
basically.
care. It was bad.
It was the demo tape they gave to MCA that made them sign
I
the
know.
Hip.
And then they came out with a
Couldn't have been too
kick-ass
bad.
first album.
Yeah, I mean, it was the first album. That wasn't. Road Apples was the second
right.
album. What was
Up
the
to
first
Here.
album after?
Up to Here
Up to
was
Here,
the first,
that's right.
the big release, and then it was Road Apples. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so in the music video for Poets, the band, if you actually look at the background, that's the Rodents. That's what they're calling themselves in the music video. Eventually, they joined with Faye and Gord Downey in 1984, where they finally came up with the name The Tragically Hip. The name itself is actually a reference to a skit by Michael Nesmith entitled The Tragically Hip. It was about poor people who wanted to be hip at all costs, and the rich people who raise money to assist these unfortunates in becoming hip by getting them golden toothpicks, among other things.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and do you guys know who Michael Nesmith is?
Yeah, from the Monkees.
No.
He's from
Was
the
that
Monkees.
who it is? I didn't know who it was.
Yeah, he's from the Monkees, the semi-fictional television pop rock band based on the Beatles.
Nice.
Yeah, he made this series of short skits called Elephant Parts, and that's where this Tragically Hip skit came from. And apparently, Gord Downey and the others thought that was just an awesome name for a band, and so they called themselves that. Yeah,
Cool.
that's some deep Tragically Hip lore for you there.
Yeah.
The band started getting much more serious in 1986 after being discovered by MCA. They released their first self-titled EP, which had two relatively successful songs, Small Town Bring Down and Highway Girl. And we'll just pause while my pappy gets himself some brew. I wonder if he's sporting the mug today.
He has a fancy mug, does he?
I got us Canuckonomicon mugs.
Oh, does he? I have a Finding Nemo mug right now that says, "Find a happy place, find a happy place, find a happy place."
I've just got a generic yellow mug. It's also got, let's see. Yeah, that is a crust of month-old instant coffee.
Lovely.
'Cause I'm the only one who comes in this room
Is it?
for
Yeah.
any significant period of time.
Yeah.
My wife comes in and gets out as fast as she can. Nightmare in here.
That's usually the way it is. My hubby has a room
Oh, yeah.
upstairs like that. I don't go in there unless I have to. I don't want to know what's in there. I'm not responsible.
Okay, so you're all caffeinated now, Pappy?
You didn't have to stop your groove, bud.
I did. I actually found a good place to stop, and so I
Okay.
stopped. That was after talking about Small Town Bring Down and Highway
Yeah.
Girl.
Terrible.
You
I
don't
don't
like
like
Highway
either
Girl?
of those songs. Terrible.
Really?
Well, I feel,
I kind of dig Highway
I
Girl.
feel like
Girl reminds me of the North. I like it.
Yeah. The one song I don't like is Werewolf Baby.
yeah. You know, here's the
Yeah,
thing
that one's-
about that EP I didn't like. It sounded like a Canadian band.
Oh.
Kind of had that garage band feel to it, right?
Yes, yeah, it was different.
It was like really underproduced. It wasn't a very like produced album, and it was very raw. It sounded like a recording of a bar band.
Yeah, which
Yeah,
they were.
yeah.
Yeah.
They were, yeah, for sure.
1989 is where I think things really changed for the band. Because this is when they released that powerhouse of an album, Up to Here. The album is a powerful, driving blues rock record with all the hallmarks for a hit in America. Song named after an American city? Check. New Orleans is sinking. Song about driving cars fast? Bam! Blow it high dough. Country inspired tune? Boots and Hearts, baby. Hey, what about a slow dance song that you absolutely should not slow dance to? 38 years old. It is. And this is a trend in the hip, by the way. They have all these, like, awesome slow dance songs and, like, tunes that you play when the party's winding down that you absolutely should not slow dance to or play when the party's winding down.
Actually, when you told me we were doing this topic, I started, like, looking into him and stuff like that. And I didn't realize how many conspiracies and he's actually sang about, like, because you just sing the words and you go along with it. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, I didn't realize how many there really was.
Yeah. There's, like, so much.
Yes, like, almost
deep,
every song has something in it.
Deep historical reference.
Have you heard...
Yeah.
Have you heard the whale tank story?
I don't think so. I don't think I read that one.
Well, it's just him doing that stream of consciousness thing that he does on live shows.
Yeah, yeah.
And he goes on this wild tale about how he used to work in an aquarium and he had to go into the whale tank and the one whale was falling in love with him, so the other whale got jealous. It's wild.
So bizarre.
It's the craziest thing. It's Gord Downey, the whale tank story. Go find it on YouTube.
I will.
It's utterly insane.
No doubt.
I'd never heard it before.
No.
And I looked it up. And I'm just like, this is bizarre. He's talking about, like, how Shamu's flirting with him and stuff. It's just totally wacky. He
had a thing with whales.
Just completely insane.
He had a thing with whales and polar bears and...
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 38 years old, probably the first song I can think of where the Hip write a slow dance song that absolutely no one should ever slow dance to. For those unfamiliar, 38 years old is about a man who escapes in a prison break after he was locked up for the revenge killing of a popular person in town who probably deserved it. Andrea Warner, a journalist for the CBC, points out that even in this album, some Canadianisms actually kind of slipped in a bit. The song Another Midnight seems to have been inspired by the October Crisis, which was the event that almost plunged Canada into a civil war when two different cells of a Quebecois separatist extremist movement known as the FLQ independently kidnapped important government officials, sending the government into a panic and invoking the War Measures Act. The references, though, are really oblique and really required someone who was really listening to the lyrics to actually pick up on it. And if you listen to the song Another Midnight, it's a driving rock song that mostly just sounds good and kind of makes you want to dance, so you're probably not going to pick up on the FLQ references.
Right.
I think...
And this was...
I think Tragically Hip will become a field of study in universities.
Yeah, it might.
Well, they almost have to.
to comb through their discography and pick out every reference and connect it to...
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the work is already being done by fans, but I imagine it'll probably be it'll formalized in a form of Canadian
Well, there's
studies.
the Hip Museum.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the Hip Museum, which is a website that is collecting all these. There's an awesome podcast called Fully Completely where I actually got a lot of my notes from them. And what they do is they go through every album, every song on every album, and break it down.
Oh,
and
wow.
review and discuss it. It's an awesome show.
What's it called again?
They're clearly huge fans. But they do a great job of, like, kind of really getting into the nitty-gritty of each of the songs.
What were they called again?
Fully Completely. Yep. So, Up to Here was a fantastic album, and it was quite successful in Canada.
Well, that's all that
The
matters.
next, what was that?
I said that's all that matters.
Yeah, they were hugely successful in Canada, but they didn't really break into the American market. And the next year, they released their follow-up album, Road Apples, which produced the second crop of incredible, awesome classic hip songs, like Little Bones and Twist My Arm. And it was super successful. It was number 1 on the Canadian pop charts. And it was this awesome, driving blues rock album released in 1991. Guess what album had just hit the shelves in the United States and Canada in 1991?
Thriller?
Oh no.
Nevermind. Oh, okay.
Yeah, by Nirvana.
Oh,
so
God.
this was, Nirvana's first hit album hit the shelves this year. In the few short years that the hip had been around, rock had completely changed in the United States. For many, this seems to be the main reason why they never really made it. Others cite MCA cutting sales of their albums early in the US as grunge got popular, but keeping the sales up in Canada because of those sweet, sweet CRTC regulations that kept them getting regular regular airplay on the radio. Oh my goodness.
You got it.
After all, there weren't really any Canadian grunge acts yet. The Seattle sound was only just starting to make it big in the US, and the hip were chart toppers in Canada, so they kept making their music up here and kept selling it up here, but didn't really make a big push in the United States. This changes the Canadian hip's music, and some have actually said, and I tend to agree with this, that probably the best thing ever to happen to the Tragically Hip was that they failed to break into the American market.
That's true.
I don't know
I
what you guys
agree.
think.
I agree. It probably would have ruined them.
Yeah. That's exactly what I think.
I'm
too.
glad we got to keep them for ourselves.
That's right.
Well, I think they broke into the American market the way they wanted. They could have become something else.
Yeah.
Well, they could have become another Rush.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
no, I don't think they had the musicianship for that, but they certainly could have, become like a Guess Who did crack the American market by churning out pop hit after pop hit. And there's no secret
and that's
that
kind
the
of what
Hip
I meant.
could write pop songs, but that wasn't what they wanted.
The reason why I think they would have been more like Rush than Guess Who is that they had the lyricism to be a more kind of an
I see that,
esoteric
yeah.
and brainy thinking man's rock music. But they have a really bizarre mix there. They have a like incredible lyric mastermind in Gore Downey.
Yeah. Sure.
There's no doubt that guy can write a song.
He's a poet.
Exactly. He's a poet. But they also have this really pop appealing rock sound. Like they're a band that you can throw on at a party and nobody's going to go like, I'm not high enough to listen to this right now, guys.
Everybody enjoys it.
That's me and Celine Dion.
Like when I listen to Rush, like I need to sit down and listen to Rush. You can't just put Spirit of Radio on at a party.
Oh, you can put that on, but nothing else.
Yeah. You can't put Xanadu on at a party. Like you need time and space to kind of absorb a Rush song.
To
Whereas
appreciate it.
the hip, you can do that, or you can just put them on when you're having a couple of beers with your buds.
Yeah.
Like a really bizarre mix in that way. But I do think that if they had broken into the American market, it would have been more like the Rush. It's kind of a thinking man's music, and I think they would have been either that or just completely absorbed by the kind of generic veneer that America tends to put on their pop rock hit
Yeah.
albums and stuff. It just kind of flatten everything out.
Well, I think a label in the
So
States would have insisted that they have a pop hit every album.
yeah, on every album.
Yeah, they would have for
Yeah.
sure. They would have ruined them for sure.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
for hardcore fans, just because we're used to them doing what they want and releasing what they want the public to hear.
I wonder if
Yeah.
like if Gord would have struggled with writing too, because if he had to write more what they wanted to as opposed to he writing in his own world, you know, like he
Yeah.
does.
I agree.
Yeah, and I kind of think that a lot of Gord's lyrics would have ended up on B-sides.
That's what I
C-sides,
yeah,
and
like I feel like
D-sides.
they wouldn't have been as powerful, like because he was trying to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
what they wanted.
Yeah, I think his songs would have still ended up on there because you listen to a lot of American bands, and there's always that like weird D-side song that one of the guys wrote that's just like totally bonkers
We gotta put it on.
and is not meant for like mass consumption.
Yeah.
And then they always have like their one big hit song that's usually about, you know, their girlfriend and the bad breakup or whatever. There's something that's just nice and easy to consume.
Well, there is a
But
theory.
he relates too.
There is a theory out there that that John Lennon left the Beatles because he didn't have a single A-side song.
Yeah.
Every Beatles single was Paul McCartney on the A side, John Lennon on, or one of the other Beatles on the B side.
Yeah, and that's actually it's interesting we're talking about sides because one thing that the Fully Completely podcast brings up a lot is how many of the Hip's biggest songs are B and C sides.
Yeah,
It's almost and these are often songs that got singles, but they're coming off the B side of a record, and that's just bizarre.
well, and their audience attached themselves to songs that wouldn't have been sort of major airplay. Sometimes weren't even big hits.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another Canadian band I think of that's like that is Spirit of the West, which I don't know. Have you heard of them, Canadian?
No,
girl?
I don't know them.
Do you know the song "Home for a Rest"? Often played on St. Patrick's Day.
Maybe to hear it. I was gonna say not off the top of my head.
It's You'll have to excuse me. I'm not at my best. I've been gone for a month.
Oh yes, I get you. Yes, around St.
That
Patty's
song
Day, I
is
remember
like a
it.
C-side on that album. It's not even got a single release. The Spirit of the West is this weird kind of like
Folk
political
rock? Yeah.
folk band. Yeah, political folk rock band. And so most of their A-sides and single releases are like these heavy political songs, and they just kind of threw this drinking song on there for fun or something. I don't
Right,
know the whole
right.
history of it, and it exploded. It's not even been released as a single since then. So, I wonder if that's just a part of the Canadian music industry. And also the Hip have this tendency to bury their hit songs deep into their albums, so you kind of have to listen to the whole album
Yeah.
to get to it. Especially when tapes and records, and not CDs, you couldn't just skip between tracks, which the young folk may not be aware
Yeah,
of. You used to have to listen to a
You
whole
young
album.
whippersnips.
So it's hard to imagine that they would have developed a distinct voice that would come to define them later on if they had. Rush, for instance, was a Canadian prog rock band that broke into the American market in a big way. They predated the Hip by 6 years, having formed initially in 1968. Their lyrics are as esoteric and intelligent as Gord Downey's, but they were much more palatable to America's alternative market. Part of it was timing. They managed to make prog rock in a time when prog rock was huge in the US and Canada, and they broke into the market at just the right time for that. But part of it is also that, like the Hip's first two albums, their lyrics are decidedly less unapologetically Canadian than the Hip's work starting with Fully Completely. So let's talk about the Fully Completely album. Because I think, in my opinion, this album really signals that shift of the Hip from being a rock band to a Canadian rock band.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, a very Canadian band.
I can see that, yeah.
Yeah, there was a definite shift in subject matter. Yeah, I think they latched on to the idea of history, of throwing bits of esoterica into every song, whereas the first two albums were more straight ahead blues rock.
Yeah. So Fully Completely has on it, it's got music that was unapologetically Canadian. If you like, before this, if you wanted music that was unapologetically Canadian, you had to look to folk music. You had groups and artists like Stan Rogers. Stan Rogers' music was undoubtedly Canadian. He even had some modest success south of the border, including a story of him playing a concert in Chicago when the city was snowed out and still managing to almost fill the venue that he was playing at. He wrote songs like Fogarty's Cove and The Northwest Passage. Hugely successful artist, but he was a folk artist. He wasn't really a mainstream pop artist. He only managed to release a few albums before dying tragically in a plane crash in 1983. And then, of course, there's Gordon Lightfoot, whose song "That Good Old Hockey Game" is practically Canada's second national anthem. Oh, that's Stompin' Tom Connor. You're right. Gordon Lightfoot was Edmund Fitzgerald,
That's
Wreck
right.
of the Edmund
Yes.
Fitzgerald. Yeah, I'm dumb.
Yeah.
You're right. Stompin' Tom Connor did that Good Old Hockey Game. And it's practically Canada's second national anthem, right after "We Are the Beaver" by the Arrogant Worms. Fully Completely was an album that really set them apart, and not just because it was full of Canadian references. As journalist Andrea Warner points out in her article for the CBC how the Tragically Hip became Canada's band, the Hip were just as critical of Canada as they were warm and praising towards it. They weren't simply a mouthpiece by which Canada could kind of wallow in its own glory. Early on, they were already pointing the finger at Canada and saying, "Do better." And no song, I think, better encapsulates that than Wheat Kings. Now, are you guys familiar with the song Wheat Kings?
Oh, yeah.
Every
I play it at
everybody
every
does.
gig.
You especially. Yeah, I was going to say, it's another slow dance song that you should absolutely not slow dance to.
That's right. David Milgaard.
Yeah, that's right. It's also the song that every Canadian guitarist learns to play so that when things are slowing down at their friend's kitchen party, they can whip out the old six string and strum out a tune that everybody's going to like.
Yeah.
And so to do that, they strum out a tune about the wrongful imprisonment of a teenager who was locked in prison for 23 years.
That's correct. It's a David Milgaard story. Yeah.
Yeah, it's right. It's the David Milgaard story, which is a nightmarish miscarriage of justice, a testament to crappy police work and crappier friends, and just another example of something horrifying from Canada's history, which this podcast really loves to talk
I
about.
love to dig out the dirt, that's for sure.
Yeah, so I'll probably have to do a David Milgaard episode at some point.
Yep, it is fitting for your
If you
channel.
guys...
It's fitting for your channel.
It definitely is. Yep. Wheat Kings is an absolute indictment of how the case was handled. It even makes direct reference to the fact that the Canadian justice system didn't really have a way of honestly handling people who didn't simply confess their crimes after being locked up, with the lyric, "No one's interested in something you didn't do." The Hip weren't nationalistic, and I would say they probably weren't even really patriotic. Although I do tend to think of the Saturday morning breakfast cereal comic on patriotism versus nationalism, where patriotism wants to improve their house, and nationalism already believes they have the best house and there's no way you can make it better. Yeah. Uh, Gord Downie actually made reference to this. He was speaking to a fan at a Canada Day concert he had organized. After the fan asked him about why he was speaking bitterly about Canada Day, Gord responded, "I see our role or responsibility as musicians to be musical. We were a little uncomfortable with the way the other musicians on the bill were treated. After an Evian bottle full of urine was hurled at the stage, it became a little difficult to go along with this whole fraternal brotherhood thing. Probably a minority, but we had invited all those people as our guests, and we felt that we had assembled a cool and an interesting day of music. It was that day that I began to think that booze together with nationalism or patriotism was a very dangerous mixture. Ultimately, I believe everything would have been way better if we'd done the whole thing on July 2nd. We could have celebrated the Canada of the South, and not the Canada that is sold to us." So you get this idea of a band that sees itself as Canadian, but not as a patriotic Canadian band, if that makes
I
sense.
saw an interview too when I was watching some stuff where he said like how when he did the last leg tour and like how everybody in Canada was so supportive of him. He said he was surprised by that because he's like, I haven't always said the nicest things about Canada, but he said them because he's trying to make people aware and like this is what we're living in, like, and this is the only platform he has to share it. So he's like, even though people think he's being aggressive or mean, he's trying to get the point across. And I thought it was just a really good interview.
Well, Andrea Warner actually brings that up, and she says that by holding Canada accountable, they have modeled how best to love a country
Yes,
by
yeah.
demanding that country be better.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was the feeling I think I always got from the Hip is, yeah, he was critical, but it wasn't critical because he hated Canada.
No, no. I always
was-
felt like he was standing up for us.
Yeah, he was critical because he loved Canada.
Yeah,
I don't know. What do you think, Pappy?
Yeah, well, it never came across as negative. It was always,
No.
it was more instructional. It was kind of like, I defy
Yeah,
you
it was-
to be better than this. Yeah.
Yeah, it was constructive.
I was to say a lot of people wouldn't even be aware of some of the situations if it weren't for things he pointed out too, which was good on his.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was what was beautiful about his music is that it wasn't just feel good patriotic rock.
Hit. Yeah.
Yeah, he wasn't Canada's Toby Keith.
No.
No, no.
He was standing up for Canada and Canadians, but
All of
not
them.
Canada's politics or Canada's culture.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And I think Gord Downie really embodied this sense of the Hip wholeheartedly. Right up until his death from brain cancer on October 17th, 2017, 2 years ago to the day that this episode will be released, Gord Downie campaigned for a better Canada. In 2016, he and his brother Mike teamed up with the Wenjack family to create the Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Fund, which raised money supporting actions to encourage reconciliation with the First Nations. And the big effect that the Hip had on Canadian music, there's no more a stigma of not making it in America. I don't think anybody now can say if you don't make it in America, you've not been a successful Canadian band.
Yeah.
Like I'd say groups like Dallas Green, Angel and Airwaves, and them, Alice in Chains, are they Canadian? I can't remember.
I don't think so.
Yeah. but Dallas Green for sure. I don't know.
Our
Some
Lady
other groups that
Peace,
Our Lady Peace. Yeah,
Trooper.
yeah. They owe a lot to the hip, really making Canada a center for rock and making Canada a place you can be a successful rock
Yeah, you
artist.
don't have to move to the States to be good at something.
No.
In fact,
Um,
it's probably, uh, for Canadians, it's now looked at as a sign of weakness if you go to the States to break into a market.
yeah,
You know,
especially in rock. I think in pop you get a bit more of a pass, but in rock, absolutely.
Yeah.
well, for instance, like it's really sad because, as you know, I'm kind of connected to the music industry, and
Hmm.
um, a lot of people think you got to go to Nashville to be a songwriter. Like
No.
it's a thing. People go to Nashville and write songs, and
Yeah.
to me, it's a false thing. It's like, you got 4 or 5 people sitting around a table coming up with the perfect concoction of garbage to sell,
Yeah.
and that's what
Yeah.
Nashville does.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas you had a band like the Tragically Hip, Gord Downey, who it was uncompromising. He
Yes.
never felt like he had to somehow homogenize the sound, homogenize the lyrics, make it so that it's more palatable for his audience. He said, "Here's the product, here's my art, come if you want."
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've seen that a lot in Canadian rock music since then.
Hmm.
Um, from high school up until my car's radio broke, I used to listen to Sonic all the time. And what I thought was remarkable, Sonic is a alternative rock station here in Edmonton. Um, what's remarkable is that most of what they play is Canadian music. And it's not because of CanCon laws. It's because if you want good alternative music, most of it's Canadian. Like, especially nowadays. Not so much when grunge was huge, but nowadays that, like, kind of the market's diversified a lot more. We have a lot of really powerful alternative music coming out of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I think because you don't get the same kind of financial sort of, I don't know, success through having a successful Canadian act. So you really have to love what you do, first of all, but you also have to stay grounded because 9 times out of 10, you're also working a day job. So you
Yeah.
don't get that sense of ego in very few
No.
senses. You get Brian Adams, Celine Dion, those people, who do a Vegas show or whatever, and Bobby Curtola, who has actually been being inducted into I think the Canadian Music Hall of Fame, which I'm surprised he hasn't been yet. But but you get these acts, and they're sort of compromising, but they're full-time acts that make a ton of money, but they're indecipherable from an American act.
Yeah. About the only thing that makes Celine Dion stand out is that she's French.
Yeah, she's got a bit of an
Like,
accent. That's right. Yeah,
yeah.
and she beats her
That's
chest
what
when
makes
she
Celine
sings.
Dion
Yes.
stand out. It's not her music. Her music doesn't make her stand out. I mean, she's an amazing singer,
Yeah.
but she sounds like every other diva singer from the United States.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
So, um, yeah. So that's how I think the Tragically Hip really changed the face of Canadian music and Canadian rock and became, I think, a cultural tour de force in our country. And just a group that has had a profound impact on Canada. For me, the hip was always the soundtrack of summer. Because
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what it was, but you always had the hip on in the truck when we were driving around in the summer, Dad.
Well, because the Father's Day gift every year or every 2 years was the newest hip album.
Oh yeah, I guess that would make sense.
And I really, I mean, I don't. I was driving by myself, I think, when I was in my Rush phase, there was nothing but Rush playing. But but for sure, the Tragically Hip is the soundtrack of my my life since you guys were kids.
Yeah.
I was gonna
Well,
say
because
I
they would
grew
have
up.
been just getting big right after I was born.
I
So
grew
I was
up
born in
on
'88.
Lake
Go ahead.
Erie, and we used to go to the beach and stuff all the time, and he would be playing over like the speakers, you know. So like almost any summer day you're at the beach, you would hear a Tragically Hip song. You couldn't go a day without being there and hearing one.
Yeah.
Always remember him. And then same thing at New Year's. He played in Niagara Falls so many times. I seen him probably 3 or 4 times as a teenager, just out in the rain, standing there listening to him. Like free show, you just had to come.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, and I think for me, he really defined how I listen to music,
Yeah,
and like he's such a unique sound.
he is.
And such a unique way to interact with music. Like I can't think of another album that I could just as easily put on when I'm having a cookout
Yeah,
as
and
I
everybody
could
is
when I really
enjoying.
want to engage with the music.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I hope this helped to spread the word a bit, especially to all 15 of my American listeners
Hey,
and all one of my New Zealand listeners. Um, I just want to give a couple shout outs here. First of all, to the reporting of Andrea Warner at the CBC, whose journalism I got a lot of this from, and also to the Fully Completely podcast, who I also referenced for a lot of the information here. If you really want to deep dive into the hip and into their music, go listen to Fully Completely. They do a fantastic job and have some really amazing guests on a few of their episodes, so check it out. Uh, you already know my Patreon and my Ko-fi. CG, do you want to plug your pluggables?
You can find me at Nothing Canada on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and my website is nothingcanada.com. You can find everything there. That's about it.
And check out Nothing Ever Happens in Canada. It's actually a super awesome podcast. They approach or they you approach stuff quite a bit differently than we do. I'm a lot more cynical.
I like to
So
sugarcoat
if you
things.
um and you do a fantastic job with your editing and your production. So I just want to give a shout out and encourage all one listener you might get from my show to go listen to you.
If you enjoy Canada, stop by.
Yeah, that's right. Uh, yeah, so thank you everybody for coming out. Thank you to Canadian Girl for coming on the show.
Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you. Oh yeah, no problem. Like it was just fun. And thank you to my dad for introducing me to the hip.
Yes. Good job, Dad.
yay, yay, Dad.
All right, everyone,
All right.
keep your eyes open.
Until next time.
Bye bye.
Canuckonomicon is a production of Crossing Clay Studios. We can be found on Twitter at Canuckonomicon, and you can contact us through email at canuckonomicon@gmail.com. Please be sure to share us with your friends and family, and keep your eyes open.